All right, welcome to another episode of Wholly Unapologetic. My name is Marcus. I'm here with my good friend Ace. How are you doing today, Ace?
One of those days. But overall good, yeah.
Any life updates or?
Yes, I have tons of updates actually right now. So my life is like full steam ahead. I'm doing an event with Orpheus Black from LA. He's flying out to Colorado. We're going to do something called Kink Bound, which is going to be an excellent event for people who haven't really dove into kink, but they want a safer, braver place to like explore. And it's actually going to be, the topic of it is kind of like beyond the binary. And so a lot of times when you drop into kink, there's the sub dom dynamics, and then there's also the masculine feminine dynamics. And we're just going to blow that up. And we're going to talk about what does it look like to fully express yourself. So I'm so excited about that. It's going to be in Loveland in October. And then I'm also writing a chapter in a multi-author book on Eros. And so I'm so excited because like Darshana from Sex, Love, and Goop is writing a chapter in there. I'm writing in there. Some of my friends are writing in there. And so it's like I don't have any free time right now. Like podcast time has been really hard for me to find because I'm so busy, but it's a good problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a little bit of a hiatus, but we're back at it. That's got to be such a cool
Yes.
feeling too, because Sex, Love, and Goop was a big part of your awakening. And now you're working with these people, and that probably inspired you back then. Does that feel really good to start being
Yes.
colleagues with these people?
Yeah, I mean, literally today I was just talking with Erotic Blueprints, like the executive director and Ian, and like these are my friends now. The people that I saw on TV, on Netflix, I'm actually like spending time with and doing projects with. It's a wild journey. I'm loving it.
That's so awesome. Congrats.
Yeah, thanks, man.
For people that have been listening to the podcast, those are some of our guests that we've talked to in the past as well. So they'll be
So
have heard
true.
about some of these developments. Yeah, I've had
Yeah.
exciting couple days myself too. I submitted my paperwork for official name and gender marker change, which was great. Ace was so kind, trying to help me get some funds together basically for that. And I realized I could fill out a form that says, I don't have money. Can you please still let me do this? And they took it. So hopefully that all goes through well. I'll have my like court appearance date in like a month. And then I can go through and start changing things, which is really exciting. I just wanted my own name on my marriage certificate, and very happily engaged. And it's just going to feel really good. And then if I ever get dead named, it could just be like, nope, it's legally there. But yeah, so that's exciting. That's validating. It feels like a big step. Although it has been nice, I've been working at a place that I've been able to use my chosen name. And then lots of places let you still use a chosen name, which is really nice. So thank you to all app makers and people that work for other companies. Like on Lyft, I drive around, and once I was able to change my name there, it just made a whole world of difference for people not being kind of confused, getting in my car, seeing another name. So yeah, grateful that it hasn't been, if I didn't get to legally change my name, I've been able to exist for about a year now. Largely fine. So it's still a very exciting step. And then another big one too is tomorrow I'll have my first consultation for top surgery. So excited about that. It's going to be just a hugely validating thing. So for a long time now, I've been getting these referrals from my doctor, and I'll call them up, and like 10 minutes into the conversation, they find out I'm trans, and then they're like, oh, we don't, he can't help you with that. Bye. And so to finally have someone who's like, oh, is it for top surgery? Okay. So you just let me know, FTM, right? And that, or is it this or that? It's just been so nice to already be taken care of in that way. And it's real, it's happening. And so I've been asking all sorts of friends for advice and tips and things like that, but I'm really excited. I still have no idea if it'll be then, 6 months from now or longer or whatever, but still feels like some big steps. So I'm excited. Feeling
Man,
grateful.
I'm so excited for you. That is a huge, huge part of your journey. Like all the things you're just talking about right now are massive. So congrats.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it's just like, I never thought I could live to see a day where I could be like shirtless at the beach or something like that. I think a lot of trans people can struggle with even seeing a future for themselves, and so that's just a big one that I mean, like when I can actually have that moment, it's going to be absolutely amazing. So happy to be alive. It's just something I don't take for granted. So yeah, those are some happy updates from us. We should now switch over to our very special guest. Ace, would you mind introducing us to our friend here?
Yeah, I am so excited about this one because RJ actually invited me to their podcast a few weeks ago. And they do a fantastic podcast entitled Trans Embodiment Pod. And so go check that out. But the cool thing about RJ is that they have a master's in some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about with like global health and trans healthcare. And they have a wicked awesome story that they shared with me. And I don't want to actually share it with the audience because I want them to be able to share it. But I am just so excited. RJ, thank you so much for taking some of your time out today. I know you're incredibly busy with your own stuff going on. But I think that what you have to bring to the table, the world needs to hear. So thank you. And I would love for you just to start out with what's on your mind right now. I mean, we gave a couple quick updates about our journey. Is there anything that's like, oh, I wish I could have spoke about this while you guys were talking about that?
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to be joining you. And Marcus, I hope that you'll be coming on my podcast very soon.
Yes, please. I would
uh,
love to.
yes, I would love that. Let's see. I don't know. I'm somebody who tends to be so present, and I was just so engrossed with both of your updates. I wasn't even thinking about me or the world, which is great because right now we all need a little escape from the world.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it's great to be here and have such creative energy, be in a space with three trans creators. I think that there's something really special and unique about that. And I couldn't be more hyped to be a part of what we're all building here.
Absolutely. And so it's kind of easy to imagine that we just need more voices out there when it comes to trans voices and getting out there in the media. So it's amazing in any rate that you're having a podcast. And I know you're bringing on amazing guests for that as well. But what was it for you where it was like, okay, I got to start this, and this is kind of the void that I want to be filling here or adding to the conversation?
That is such a great question. So I had planned to go on for a PhD. I know the White Tower of academia sucks, but
Mhm.
I love education. I love being part of education. We all have to pick our battles. And unfortunately, I was accepted into a gender studies PhD program to do trans research. And then the world right now is not a very friendly place to be doing that, and particularly within any sort of system. So those plans really had to be put on hold. I had a bunch of life events that just really turned my whole world upside down. But I still wanted to be creating. I still consider myself a gender theorist, and I wanted to find alternative avenues to be doing gender theory. And I don't believe that you have to be part of academia to be a theorist or to be a thought producer or somebody who is creating important knowledge production. It doesn't have to be this thing that has to be so institutionalized, right? Every single one of us, trans people or other minorities on the ground, we're doing thought production all of the time, and that thought production is really important. And it's important to give it a platform. So the podcast was kind of about that. Initially, the idea was a podcast called Transcestors. It was going to specifically focus on trans ancestors because ancestry work is really important to me, as I'm sure we'll talk about later. um but then I decided there was a lot more I wanted to do with it, so I sort of broadened the idea out to be we do have a transcestor series, so we still cover trans ancestors, but then I also do deep dives on topics that are really important in gender, and particularly to transgender people and gender expansive people as a whole. And then of course my interviews. So yeah, that's kind of the story there.
I love that. I was so excited as I was doing kind of research for this of just knowing how well educated you are on this topic. But yes, this is something that touches everybody. You don't have to have the academic background, but I love that you do. So if you'll forgive the question, I know we get this so much as trans people, or we see it so much online, the idea of like, it's basic biology. Like none of this really is all that basic. What are some of the ones that come to your mind immediately when you get these kind of ignorant perspectives on gender or anything in this spectrum? What are kind of like the key things that come to your mind of like, if I could just teach them this one thing or these few things that you're especially
Yeah,
passionate about?
I love that. There's one in particular that's coming to my mind. So just to lay a foundation, I don't believe that we should be talking about biology when we talk about gender or sex. Like, I think it's sort of a losing game.
Mhm.
But that said, I still have my background in biology and in healthcare, and I still want to come to the fight. So, specifically when people are really stuck in the idea of the sex binary and really just firmly latch on to that, like, oh, it's you're creating new genders, you're creating new sexes. Like, I want to point to Darwin, who was an asshole. Let's not let's make that very clear. He was a colonial asshole. But sometimes you have to fight with the right tools depending on the backgrounds people are coming from. And I want to pull on Darwin, and I always want to say that that anything in biology is a spectrum, and it goes in line with classic Darwinism that sex would be a spectrum as well. And there's tons of evidence of this. Intersex people exist. They're as common as redheads. Okay.
Mhm.
And that doesn't even include intersex people who never know they're intersex, because you often have to get a genetic test to even know. And actually, I think that statistic specifically calls out people who are assigned intersex at birth, which, like, at least half of intersex people don't find out till puberty. So it's probably more common than being a redhead in the end.
Interesting.
Right. And so I think, like, it boggles my mind how much we can do research and throw any amount of real biology at that conversation, and yet people are so just they just turn away from it. They don't even want to see it or hear it out. And I'm sure you've both experienced that. I don't know, what do you have thoughts on that, or things that you particularly say back?
I'm going to give you a chance, Ace, because I could go in a lot of directions.
My only thought is they're incredibly tone deaf. I remember one of the very first seminars that I went to after I realized that I was trans and I was coming out to people, and they were talking about how, when conception actually happens, it's like 6 weeks until they actually know if you're female or male because of the chromosomes and all that and biology. And I'm not a scientist or anything like that, but that blew my mind. It's like everybody is technically probably female at the beginning. And then as your brain develops and as your body develops, then, it shifts into something. And you can have a disconnect between the brain and the body and what that actually ends up being, which is why possibly some of us are trans. I'm not an expert in this field. I just know that blew my mind. And so if you want to correct me in anything that I just said, RJ, you're more than welcome to, because you have way more education than I do in this.
No, I think that you're nailing exactly the conversation that has been really successful when we are trying to fight these ideas, and particularly use biology to talk about these ideas. One thing that I push back on, and this is not pushing back on you, but even in general to what I said earlier of, like, I don't like talking about biology because I think it's a losing game. But the idea of the binary is a false kind of belief, right? That we have built so much of our science on. Literally, our entire understanding of biology has been built on it. Not to mention psychology and history and all of these other fields have been built on this false narrative of a binary. And so even the idea of, like, I think this goes to the concept of born in the wrong body, right? That is a really convenient narrative that's helpful to teach cis people about the trans experience, but it's not actually a good representation of the trans experience. Maybe for some people, but for a lot of people, it's not really that accurate. And I think the same thing, like the idea of the mind and the hormones and the body can have this disconnect. It's true when we're talking about this little box that the people we're trying to change their minds are living in. But then, like, among trans folks, right, we expand that so far beyond. Like, we don't even have to be talking in this idea that the body and the brain and the hormones or whatever are separate, the spirit, like, this is all very colonial ideology. And I think it's really fun to move outside of that. Although I also think it's very useful for what you said, for trans people to be able to throw that at these people who just believe in the binary so much.
I was just going to say, as someone assigned female at birth, like, I'm well versed in what it's like to hate your body, being taught to hate your body. So I think it's especially important now as a trans person to not be at war with my body and be like, oh, I'll just be trans enough when, or I'll be man enough when. And I also acknowledge that I have an enormous amount of privilege as I start to be perceived more masculine. So there's, the benefit to that. But really, and for as far as my transition is concerned, it's not tied to this idea of wrong body, let me cut this part off. And, transphobic people use such terrible language in terms of they're mutilating their bodies and all these things. So I just think I really like that you brought that up, because I will support however trans people decide to talk about their own journey. But I think especially when you're familiar with that AFAB experience, it's so important to not hate myself more a different way now that I'm trans. I'm so grateful I don't have those mindsets anymore. I don't use that language around it, because that can be such an unhealthy perspective. But go ahead, Ace. Thank you.
My question was, like, what do you think is the best way to talk to cishet people about it? Like, what have you found that works?
So my favorite answer to this question is actually more of a political response than a biological one. And just a little bit about my background. I also am part of this trans changemakers cohort with One Colorado, who is the policy organization, LGBTQ policy organization in Colorado. They're the ones responsible for blocking any anti-LGBTQ and particularly anti-trans bills that come forward. They're in charge of putting forward bills that are protecting trans people. There was just one really important one that was passed that protect trans youth from discrimination in the school systems, particularly dead naming. And that was a really, really important bill that we worked on. And so in response to your question about how do we talk to people about this, my answer is about deep canvassing. And I can send you a resource to put in your resource section. But deep canvassing is basically this idea of you're going and you're talking out in communities, and it could be formal through a political process like door knocking, or it can just be something that you use in your day-to-day life. And it's basically a way of slowing down a conversation. A deep canvassing conversation should take like an hour. And it's about focusing on a single topic, maybe even narrowing down transness from one big thing to like a specific idea, for example, the biology of it. And it's about really listening to what somebody has to say and not getting judgmental or defensive, which is incredibly hard if you're somebody who has that lived experience, right? It takes a lot of practice, and it might not even be for trans people to do. Like, this might be work where we want to call in our allies, call in cis people. But as a trans person who is about doing the work, it's also something I do. And so it's basically about holding space and just responding to people compassionately and continuing to push an issue with this sense of love and kind of really hearing people out. And it's also about pulling on personal stories. So, for example, if you're talking about the biology aspect of it, you know, somebody's saying their piece that is very entrenched in these colonial ideologies around the gender binary, and then you can respond with, hey, my experiences, or my cousin's experience, my friend's experience. Hey, here, look at this picture on my phone of my friend who's trans who doesn't have that experience, and let's talk about it. And that has been shown to be incredibly impactful in changing people's views. And in particular, when we're talking about policy, there's this large group of people that is kind of like this silent majority who, as far as at least one polling that we've done at One Colorado, they believe that trans people should have rights and shouldn't be discriminated against. But then they also believe in things like bathrooms should be gendered. And so it's sort of about like bridging that understanding and that gap and showing how those two things relate, because this majority doesn't understand that. And that's really what deep canvassing is about. And it can be really, really impactful for those kind of conversations.
So what I've found to be most helpful, I grew up in a conservative Republican Christian household.
Tell me.
Right? So I'm around these people 24/7. And a lot of times they never knew a trans person. And the people back home still don't know that I'm trans because basically I just left and started a new life. But what I've realized that is the most helpful thing for me is the term build a bigger table. And it's literally sharing my life experience with the people that I'm around in my local community. So intentionally going out to lunch with people or dinner with people, sitting at the table and just sharing my life experience. That's the whole reason why I totally walked away from the Christian faith, because it didn't align with who I am and what I know to be true in this world. And so sharing some aspects of that with people has been incredibly helpful, because they don't see it. They don't experience it on a day-to-day level. They don't know that we're scared when we walk out in public, or, you know, when we have some of these laws that come across that are really taking away our rights. It doesn't affect them. But when they get to actually have a meal with me and see the real ramifications of the decisions and the implications that are happening in my life, the consequences of these actions taking place, then they can start to empathize with me and say, oh, wow, this really does have an impact on you. As an American citizen who's done nothing illegal, you do not deserve to have this upon you. You deserve to be free. And so that's been a really interesting place for me to explore, especially with people that are like veterans, right? I have a couple of friends, like I have a lot of friends actually that have served. And now with all the different things that are coming down on trans people and them being kicked out of service and all of that, getting their retirements taken away, I'm like, if that was you and you served for 15 years, which it is, would you be okay with that? it would have a direct implication on your life. And so just giving them those little glimpses of like, hey, this is how life is for a trans person in America today. Can you start to empathize and recognize the reality that we're dealing with?
Yeah, that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. Marcus, I really want to hear from you. We've sort of been monopolizing the microphone between
No,
the
this
two
is
of
so
us.
great. I really appreciate it. I did want to give you a chance because you mentioned that you might be willing to talk about something that was rather traumatic that happened recently. And I know, Ace, you kind of brought up the absurdity of people saying like, oh, you haven't lost any rights, but this is our true, real lived experience. So RJ, would you be willing to talk about what had happened to you recently?
Oh yeah, sure. The hate crime. Yeah. So I this is not my first hate crime that I've ever experienced. But it was especially impactful because it was exactly how trans people die. And I'm actually so excited to be able to talk about it here. I had thought about trying to figure out a segment on my podcast, but it's really nice to be held, and have other people who are running the podcast. So I appreciate the space for it. So trigger warnings for anybody who's listening. We're going to talk about a transphobically motivated hate crime that also includes some like general sexist violence. But I won't go into details too much. But the reason that it was so impactful is because it's exactly how trans people die. It was a situation where somebody expressed interest in me, which every woman out there has experienced, and many, many trans people have experienced. And then when he realized that I was not trans, when he realized that I was trans, it became violent. And he actually ended up like turning the whole situation around and calling the cops on me for indecent exposure, which is historically the law that has been used to police trans people throughout modern history. So that was also just a really horrific experience. And luckily I was able to leave before the cops showed up. I had lots of support. I was at a public place at a restaurant, and the restaurant staff was fantastic about it. But yeah, I think that is what's so scary about it is I live in an area that is incredibly trans affirming. There's a lot of trans people here. And even so, transphobic violence is going up. Hate crimes are going up among my friends. I passed a stop sign the other day that said "kill trans kids." Um, and so I think there's this we're living in this political climate right now where these kind of behaviors have become emboldened, right? It's
Mm.
become more acceptable and more okay. And so trans people are going to continue to experience these things at increased rates. We're going to be continuing to be impacted in our everyday lives. For me, it was sitting at a restaurant. I was getting ready to give actually an erotic poetry workshop. So I
Mm.
was, dressed a little slutty, but there's still that shame. It was what I was wearing. It was my fault, right? All of these narratives that women experience when they experience sexual violence and harassment, and also trans people are not exempt from that experience. Um, so yeah, I think that is like a little overview of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I just want to kind of let it in for a second. Rush straight to the next question. Whew. It is so hard to live in the world as a female and have to be afraid of male violence all the time. I have what'll seem a very kind of light story in comparison, if you don't mind, but I think about it a lot. And it was early in my transition when a man came up to me at a gas station, and I ignored him because as women, we have to always be afraid and always expect that anything can turn violent, whether you say nothing or whether you say something. So usually you say nothing and try not to interact. And I think maybe he was asking for money or something, but I'd ignored him. And then at a certain point, he just kind of changed his tone. He's like, "Come on, man, you're not even going to talk to me." And that's when I realized that he saw me as a male. So again, early on in my transition, I wasn't expecting it, but he saw me as a male that was just ignoring him. And then it was just like his bro wasn't like having a conversation with him. Like, what the heck? Come on, man, treat me like a human. It was just a totally different thing than being this object to that male gaze that they can get something from, or that can be the object of violence. And so it was just this interesting moment of seeing him from that protective lens that you always have to have when you're assigned female at birth and or perceived female in the world. I don't know if people that are born cis and male know the extent of that. Of always, the joke is, yeah, keys in between your fingers, but to always be kind of seeing the world as a dangerous place is really exhausting. So there is part of me now that I'm more perceived male in the world, where I do feel like I can relax so much more. I don't worry about walking on a different street at night, kind of a thing. But then there's a whole different side of it where you have to worry about being perceived trans and what can happen then. So I really appreciate you sharing your story, because I think cis people need to understand that this is real and this isn't some kind of blue state trend that's just for funsies and they're transing all the kids. It's like if you're saying we choose this, we're choosing everything that comes with it, right? And I think that's, in my ignorance as someone raised in the church, there's like, well, why are they offended if you think it's a choice to be gay? You can only really say that if you're completely ignorant about every way that life is infinitely more complicated and difficult by being gay in the world, and how poorly you can treat and losing family over it, and all those different things that many of us have experienced. So yeah. One thing I want to circle back to on that topic that you had talked about was this idea of colonialism. And I want to link that really quick. There's so much we can talk about there, but in particular to this idea of biology and how really it's much more recent in terms of how we think of that being such a definite thing. Do you want to jump in there about some of the history there of the gender binary?
Oh my gosh, what a great topic. Okay, this is
a big
so
one,
great.
but also a fun one. I thought, you might like it.
Yeah, so I'm actually a quick pitch about my podcast. I have been in the middle of a 6-part series on trans medicalism. And for your listeners who might not know, who should also go and listen to that podcast series, trans medicalism is an ideology that believes that trans people are only valid and legitimate if they are transitioning basically within the binary, are seeking surgeries, and are seeking to completely, quote unquote, pass as, the gender that they're seeking to be. And it's a really interesting ideology that is entirely based in the fairly recent history of trans people being forced to medically and legally transition in order to be legitimized, in order to have any form of rights, to have marriage rights, to have rights to passports and documentation, to have rights to move through the world in the way that it feels, integrated for them. This even goes as far as rights to open bank accounts. All of our documents, they give us access to so many things. And especially in the world that we live in today, if we're not able to change our documents to match our presentation or how other people might perceive us, then we often are excluded from all of those things. And that's currently happening all over the world in tons of countries that don't allow for those things to happen. But it's actually really interesting. It comes from the Harry Benjamin era of biology. And Harry Benjamin was actually, I think, a really good guy. He was a cis man who was really interested in trans people and helping trans people to receive bottom surgery and top surgery and to basically improve our lives. But unfortunately, that era of medicalization has sort of become this nasty thing all over the world, where in many countries trans people are forced to medically transition in order to be seen as trans, in order to be legitimized. And we have that strong history here in the US as well. And so it's one of the reasons that some trans people are really against medical transition for themselves, although of course we mostly believe that everybody should have access to better and better trans healthcare, right? Because that's a right and that saves trans lives. But yeah, and there's also a long history. There's a kind of this hand-in-hand history with the medical model, which is a legal model that basically uses biology in order to determine legal rights for intersex people and people who are seeking trans rights, whether it's transition paperwork or being just to be seen as non-binary, these kind of things. And so there's this really interesting bedfellows, the trans medicalism ideology and the medical model, in that it's created this entire world that sort of tells trans people that we have to transition and we have to look a certain way and we have to express gender in a way that is palatable to cisgender people and in a way that that cisgender people imagine gender to be, right? And that's really painful, particularly as a non-binary person, because that whole construct doesn't make space for people like me. And it's really important that we deconstruct those kind of ideas. What is the question we started with here? Am I answering the question?
That was great. I wanted you did it perfectly, of just basically understanding that this idea of, oh, biology is so black and white. Like, these are things that are much more recent. What I guess I had kind of led into it was more from the colonialism side, and how there's a whole racist history with how, the white race is more perfectly binary. So if you could run with that, or we could kind of riff on what we were just
thank
talking
you
about.
for bringing me back and reining me in. No, okay, so
great.
This whole history of transmedicalism and the medical model and legal system, it's a colonial project. This is all colonial ideology, and it is a way to control people. It is all about white men having land ownership and ownership over people and women and people of color and everything, the whole world, right? And so this is really one leg of many, many legs of the colonial project. And in particular, I think it's important to note that the gender binary is completely necessary in order to uphold that project. And so that is one of the reasons that it's so entrenched in everything that we are and everything that we do, because it's all really about reproduction, which I know you all have talked about on the podcast a lot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the control of women's bodies is what we're already seeing now. We've already lost Roe v. Wade and all these things. It gets so and more overt and disgusting every day in terms of what we're seeing, that it's really just how much we can get white women to produce as many white babies as possible, which is really just the exact playbook, of course, from what we see in World War II as well. So I'm trying to decide where to even jump in here, but yes, the tying into colonialism there is just so crucial, because there is this idea that white people are more easily distinguishable to male and female, and that's proof that they are the better race for that reason. So any non-binariness was seen as some kind of a flaw. And also, to tie it back around to what you were saying about intersex people, that there have often, if I'm not mistaken, surgeries done on intersex babies just to make them more one or the other, right? And so much pressure to then fit into that box. And I was just talking to a friend the other day who's non-binary, and I felt like I was realizing all of this extra privilege I have because I want to fit into this particular box. That's what aligns most for me. And they were struggling with, like, some days they prefer different pronouns, and some days they want to be perceived in different ways, and it's not always the same. And so they're like, but do I explain this to everyone every time? Like, I basically fall into a different level of convenience by still fitting the binary. And what we really want to do is ultimately kind of dismantle the whole system and how problematic it is. So it ties to a lot of different things for sure. The other thing too, when you mentioned land ownership, it reminded me of what I had read about how that basically ties back to the Salem witch trials, and that they're basically women that owned land and didn't need a man, and the men didn't like that. So they're like, we got to find some other way to basically strip them of any property or anything like that. Let's say that they're witches. So ties to a lot of really frustrating stuff. I've been reading this amazing book called, I think, Jesus and John Wayne. And it's like, how do evangelicals vote for people that could be the least Christ-like? But it just is explaining in such a helpful way how the religious history is tied to this American sense of masculinity that is so the white, masculine, violent, and then tying that into the military industrial complex and militarism. And it's so many messy, but that's how they kind of tie together all these different beliefs. And I think in both cases, there's this idea with conservatives that, like, our ideas are truer because they've been around forever. And so it's basic biology. Like, this is how it's always been. And it's like, well, no, and also no. But then you think of similar things with Christians too. There's this idea of, like, it's in the Bible, it's black and white. And it's like, even, one of my favorites is that the word homosexual didn't appear in the Bible until 1946. And they figured out it was a bad translation, and they still kept it because it got too much religious fervor to get people to hate gay people than to actually be an accurate translation. And even then, you go further back, and they had different councils to decide what books of the Bible to include and what not. Like, it isn't just this perfect, of course, document that's been around since the beginning of time, like they'd like to believe, because then at that point, none of us should be having shrimp and all these other things. But that belief system that seems to be comforted by the idea that there are these binaries, that there are these black and whites, that we can have this sense of, like, oh, we know everything. But really, we're in an exciting time right now because we don't know everything, and we're learning so much, and we have the ability to learn more. So that's my mega rant on all of that. It's all connected.
Have you ever noticed how they translated the Bible with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Great white name.
Chicken and the egg too, because they all just now they name all their kids that too.
Yep.
Yeah, my brothers all got very biblical names, so there was still part of me that was like, I'm gonna have a little bit of a nod to that, just so I can pretend as if I were named by my own parents in a way. So I do have a little bit of that in my name.
It's allowed because you chose it. I always think about how, like, we're born into systems, right, that we have no voice and choice in. So the moment that you're born, you're assigned your gender, you're assigned your name. Oftentimes you're assigned your culture, your religion, all these things that we have no ability to choose as we're going around this world and figuring out what's right for us in this moment. And that's been the interesting piece for me in my journey is, right, I was indoctrinated into this lifestyle for 38 years, and I was kept in this community where, like, it was safe and I belonged in quotes, right? Like, I really didn't feel like I belonged. I was dying to myself. I was abandoning myself, right? And so it's just such an interesting space to think about, like, how do we become who we are? And how do we stay in that path, or how do we choose to break out of it and do what falls in alignment for ourselves and what's right for ourselves? It's been a really interesting inquiry for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump onto that a little bit. We talk a lot about deconstruction here on the podcast. Holy is part of our title. We're going to talk about religious trauma, all that good stuff. It's very relevant to us, but you had brought something up before we hopped on today about how there can be this pattern with people that are deconstructing where they don't necessarily value a certain amount of spiritualism, and how that can be really important to an idea of ancestry, generational healing. Would you jump into that topic for us?
I would love to. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think, and I want to preface this, I'm coming from a very white perspective here, but it pulls on a lot of understanding and knowledge from people of color who have done important decolonizing work and are always teaching and also working on building supports for their communities, and indigenous communities that are doing revitalization projects. And so I just want to call that out and say that is always a tricky line to walk. And I'm doing my best to walk it, but also I would love to be called in if there's anything that I say that should be called in. So putting that out to the listeners. But yeah, I think it's really interesting as a white person who does a lot of introspection around settler colonialism and the settler colonial project, to see how many queer people in particular have divested from religion because of religious trauma, right? And how that divestment often comes with a complete pushing away of spirituality, and spirituality is really a very important arm of our healing and our well-being and our humanity and personhood. You know, we see religion and spirituality throughout all of human history, and it's something to take care of, just like we might take care of our bodies or our minds or our environment, the people around us, our relationships, our friendships, all of these things. And I think that there's a lot of things about colonialism, and you can also see this within religions that have kind of come away from spirituality, as many institutionalized religions often do, right? That people, white people in particular, colonial people who are living within the colonial project, particularly in the US, are so divorced from the importance of taking care of our spiritual bodies, and particularly looking at white people. And this is maybe more talking about myself and my own experience, but I think that it is so important for white people like myself to be taking care of that spiritual body, and to be doing it as a part of anti-colonialism, as part of anti-racism, as a part of a feminist personal project. And for me, at least, the way that I do that is through ancestry work, which I personally kind of tie in and maybe make to be the same thing as generational trauma work, right? So generational trauma, as we often talk about it, particularly in white culture, is sort of this like scientific, like psychological, very, peer reviewed. You have to have, it's very institutionalized in its own right. And to me, it sort of sanitizes it. And it really takes out that spiritual aspect of what we're doing when we're doing generational trauma healing. Is we're doing ancestral healing. What we're doing is we're working through our ancestral lines, and we are taking accountability for the ways that our ancestors have sort of fucked us up and also maybe sort of fucked up the world. And when we can expand it out into this sort of ancestral ideology, what we can do is we can take even more accountability for the ways that our ancestors have caused harm. And as trans people in particular, I think it's really, really important to do that. And trans people, I find, are often even more reticent to talk about ancestry because we have often been so harmed by our families of origin. But one thing that I want to say is when I talk about ancestry, particularly in sort of colonial spaces and among white people who don't have good ideas of what ancestry might be, like some people might think of it as like literally their genetic lineage line or like individuals, right? The way that I have been taught to think about it, and one of my spiritual teachers, who I will have you link in the show notes, is Lama Rod, who is a Black queer Buddhist teacher who talks a lot about ancestry as a form of colonial healing. But one way that I really like to think about it is thinking about ancestry more of this like ephemeral cloud that is all of the people who have ever come to make you who you are. And that might be genetic. Those genetic components are really important, as I was talking about, to do the ancestral healing, to do our anti-colonial work. As white people, we can't really heal these racial inequities and these racial pressures that we are all under until we do that spiritual and ancestral healing work. But also, it includes chosen family. It doesn't have to be this colonial idea of biolegality and biological family, but it can include, you know, the transcestors who have created amazing and monumental foundations for us to be who we are today. It can include people who you just look up to and want to claim as part of your ancestry. And so in that way, you can get both the good, the people who you want to honor, the people you want to learn from, the people who you want to say, hey, I am doing healing for the whole world. I'm doing healing for all the people around me. I'm doing this decolonial work. I'm doing this feminist work for you, because of the knowledge you've passed down, and also for the future generations. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of what we were talking about before we hopped on mic.
Yeah, that is such a helpful explanation. Thank you. It reminds me too of a post I just seen recently that was to the effect of like, in all likelihood, there have been queer people in your family tree. Like just because you exist by likely the standard production of a male, cisgendered male, cisgendered female, that kind of a thing, that there probably are plenty of queer people in your history. And just because those stories aren't the ones that we hear, it's just so important to remind those that queer people have always existed, trans people have always existed. So what does this look like in practice for you in terms of doing this kind of work? What are some easy steps for people to start?
I love one thing I want to say about what you just said. The other thing I often will tell people, I run a trans moon circle once a month where we do a lot of this sort of ancestral work. And one thing that I always really say in that is like, you have revolutionaries in your history. There is no way that you would be alive today if your ancestry wasn't full of revolutionaries. And that revolutionary knowledge has been passed down, whether it's a revolution that you agree with or not. Like that revolutionary energy is there, and it's for you to tap into. And like when you think about that cloud, you have to think about it as like all of that knowledge is there, and it's there for your betterment and well-being. You know, it's not like this, it doesn't have this negativity that white people often hold in this space of shame and this imagination of shame. That doesn't have to be the kind of way that we do ancestry work. And it's really important that we don't get stuck in that shame, because as a lot of anti-racist writers have talked about, that's one really frustrating thing that white people do, is they get stuck in shame and then they're not doing the work. They're not actually helping. And we experience that too as trans people. You get cis people who get really stuck in the shame of misgendering and of, oh, how do I treat people right? And instead of getting stuck in that shame, they could be, actually just being allies and doing what they can and showing up the ways they can, right?
That's a really good point in terms of the idea of perfect being the enemy of good. And we live in a world where, of course, everything is written down. And am I going to get canceled by something I said 10 years ago? It's like, the kind of things you just hear in conversation, but being willing to start imperfectly, which is, as a creative, a crucial thing too. You have to be able to just get started versus I always want to spend forever planning the perfect thing, but it is facing that discomfort. I know, there's so much more work I feel that I need to do, but I just finished reading Black AF history, and it was an amazing book, and it just showed me how ignorant I am of what I would have already expected, which is that Black stories have been left out of our narrative, what we learn in school. But it just goes through the whole American story and kind of fills in so many gaps. And even there, it's just the beginning. But it was really uncomfortable to listen to. All of these stories that I had growing up and in school of the heroes of the story, and they weren't so heroic. And, you know, these good reminders too of they knew then that this thing was wrong, and not just so it was a different time. And it's really uncomfortable to face that stuff. And so I think it was a good reminder for me, not only just to learn more about something I should learn more about, but also just that this is why people avoid change, and they avoid that discomfort. They avoid being in spaces that they're not used to and confronting these things. I think a lot of people can stay in these tiny, I'll just say, conservative Christian bubbles and not be around anyone that's not just like them in their belief system. And it makes sense that they stay there because that's a safe place for them. And it's uncomfortable to go out and kind of realize what you've been missing and what you still need to learn a lot more about. So I'm kind of grateful for that experience, because it's like, I basically felt nauseous the whole time I was listening to that book because of how much it was like, this is what I was taught and this is what's actually true. And so, yeah, it's, you know, in terms of trans voices being left out too, and so much to learn about these amazing heroes. But I love that too, of knowing that we have these revolutionaries in our past, and that's why we're here, is a very emboldening idea. I like that.
Yeah, and I want to give a phrase to people who are sort of ready to sit in that discomfort, right? Because that is a big part of ancestry work. It's uncomfortable to do any sort of generational trauma healing. It's uncomfortable to go to therapy. It's uncomfortable. I think there was an episode, you said something so profound. I think it was in the episode with Mo Holloman about change. Oh, I wish I remembered. But anyway, everybody go listen to that episode. It's fantastic.
It's a great episode. She's wonderful.
but yeah, it's uncomfortable to do. And the same thing, it's uncomfortable to do the work around unpacking cisgender. It's uncomfortable to do the anti-colonial work, the anti-racist work. And the one phrase that I would really love to give people who are kind of thinking about taking care of spiritual body and maybe thinking about starting to do ancestral work but don't really know how, is to just start by calling your healed and well ancestors into space. Because what that can do is it can kind of like, you know, relieve yourself of having to hold the shame of your ancestry. It can relieve a space of you having to open yourself up to that before you're ready. And it can be a way that, especially as trans people, we need support. And especially as trans people who might not have good relationships with their family of origin, it can be a way to kind of feel that community, that family, that love and that surrounding by specifically calling that group in. And they don't even have to have names, right? This can go back as, you know, as far as time, all those revolutionaries, the queer people, the trans people in your history, right? And that's a way to call it in and to feel that nourishment and that love before, you know, you have to dive into the shame and the unpacking and the generational healing of, you know, the rough bits.
That's great. I want to ask you about this too, where the more I started digging into my trauma and the things that I wanted to heal, big one being shame and how that intersected with gender and sexuality and sex and religion and all these different things, the more I wanted it for everyone else. And I think in particular, something I'm very passionate about is particularly purity culture and how damaging that can be for everyone involved. And I got so angry, and then I did a ton of research, and then I just got angrier because I was like, oh, it's already really well documented how damaging this is. And yet that's still conversations I wish everyone were having, you know, all the time in a way when you're kind of zeroed in on something. And it's the kind of thing I wish I could, like, you know, shake my mom about, or every other woman that I've ever had interaction with, and be like, try to, I don't know, it can just be so overwhelming once you see something and you see how painful it is. And so I'm kind of like losing how to even phrase it, but to find a way to still be productive when you see something that's broken and you see something that's causing harm. The thing being that the people that are sometimes receiving the most pain from it don't even realize it, or can even hold up these systems. Something we've talked about too, and I cited Monty Maida for this, was this idea of like, why are so many women voting for people that are doing bad things to women? How is this even possible? You know? So it's a lot of different things. And my particular example has to do with the idea of purity culture, or how women are hurt through the church. But I guess I broaden it to just be in terms of the work that you do and how you try to make the world a better place, which is so wonderful. How do we hold space for all of those emotions and those frustrations, like the frustration that comes with healing, and being like, oh, wow, I have a gaping wound here. I didn't realize that was there. I've just been limping for a very long time and I didn't realize it. I thought that's just how you were always supposed to walk, not to be ableist or anything like that, but you know what I mean? How do you hold space for those emotions and those frustrations, and then also move forward and not just get buried under like, well, this is how fucked up the world is, and there are all these systems built against us trying to keep us down, and what can one person do, and you just want to give up. What is your antidote to that? How do you keep going forward?
Such a great question. And actually, it does make me think of another thing you said in an episode that I thought was so profound and I related to so deeply, which was that the more healed you become, the more, or like the less productive, I think, or like the less ambitious is what you said. Less ambitious you become. And I relate to that so deeply. Pain is incredibly motivating for me.
Yeah.
I literally have traveled all over the world. I speak 6 languages. I have lived a really big life. The reason I have my master's is all because of pain, because I was like chasing something, and I was really trying to run, and I was trying to heal, and I didn't really know what I needed. And
it's also something we see a lot in the manosphere real quick, is this idea of like, well, I think Hormozy, I mean, he's a great business guy, but he also talks a lot about like, you have to have something that makes you mad enough that you keep going, and or the guy needs to have the breakup with the girl, and then he's going to go to the gym every day. So there's a lot of that kind of toxic masculinity that loops into that motivation too, that it has to come from this angry place, because that's like the only emotion men are allowed, I guess. But I just wanted to insert that in there, so please continue.
That's such a great point. Like, I was specifically thinking about how it might show up in the trans community, or minority communities, but you're right. Like we see that
it's kind of celebrated in that space.
It's celebrated in masculine spaces. And as I don't really identify as trans mass, but functionally as trans mass people, I think that we all have to be really careful about how we relate to those narratives, right?
Yeah. So I didn't mean to derail you. I also will link someone down below, because she does a really good job of talking about how these seemingly innocuous topics that go super viral can be the pipelines to alt-right, to these toxic masculine manosphere things.
True scum.
Yeah, this kind of pure thing here can actually lead to this. So I'll link her down below, because she has amazing stuff. But yeah, sorry if I derailed you there.
No, I love that. Yeah, I think I related so strongly to your sentiment on that, because the more healed I have become, the harder it is to sort of I guess like be angry enough to engage with all of those narratives, because I'm just so at peace with myself. And it's something I think about a lot lately. I've been thinking about it a lot, of how do I continue to engage? How do I continue to make change from a really centered and peaceful place without moving into like love, white woman, love, light, peace, all of that, which I think it is really important for those of us who are socialized as women, particularly socialized as white women, to recognize that we have that socialization in us. And so it might always be something that we need to be confronting.
There's definitely the pressure to always be happy, bubbly, smiling, smiling especially. So it's an interesting thing. But then, of course, anger can be such an informative thing. And so that's one I struggle with too, because as someone raised female, you're not allowed to be angry ever about anything. And now that I'm a trans man, it's like, well, anger is kind of the only emotion you're allowed. And so I don't know what to do with it. I feel like I get this chest tightness. And so I want to be able to be like, thank you, body, you're telling me something. And I need to kind of look into this and understand it and feel through it, and not just, go back on Instagram and distract myself from emotion. But also, it's definitely not a place I want to stay. And I want to, and this is something we had a great guest, Shelby Avann, who talked about doing Reiki work. And I was just kind of amazed, thinking like, how do you hold space for other people's emotions? And then also, how do you step out of that when you need to kind of go back to your own life? And so I don't have an easy answer for it, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. But I think it is hard, like you said, socialized, especially in this white female way, not allowed to be angry, but anger can be motivating. And so how do we still maintain a motivation to help create good change in the world and help other people heal in ways that we've been able to heal, without falling into this hyper productivity thing that is what we all see all the time on our screens. And that's a tough one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, at least, that's kind of where the ancestry work and particularly the taking care of the spiritual body comes back to, because I think it's really easy to get stuck in that dichotomy if you don't have a strong, at least a relationship to your spiritual body, whatever that may be. And again, taking away the religious junk from that.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes. But at least for me, it sort of has to do with blending in, traditional psychology of, I really like internal family systems. And for me, internal family systems blends really nicely with ancestral work, because that's what you're doing. Really, you're taking care of your littles, but also taking care of the bigs in your history and all of their littles that have continued to pass down this trauma. And so for me, taking care of that inside is also about taking care of the broader network, which is also about taking care of, my immediate family and my found family. And, it has those ripples and waves outward. So that would maybe be my most succinct answer to that.
So what are some other, I know you said we were going to give us some links and things, but what's a good place for people to start? Because I think this is probably very new to a lot of people.
For internal family systems or...
Yeah, and ancestry work in general. I feel like this is all completely new to me. So I want to make sure we set people up for success.
Yeah, so I would say definitely La Marade has a podcast. It's fantastic. I think they have a podcast. I've just read their book. They have a book. It's fantastic. They have a website. I will have you link. As far as internal family systems work, there's a book called No Bad Parts that I would recommend. That's fantastic.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
You can listen, you can read, you can find a therapist that works with internal family systems, IFS. I think that those are all really, really great places to start. And then, I think also there's this element of kind of make it up as you go. I would really caution, particularly white people, around appropriation, right? When we're thinking about ancestry, when we're thinking about spiritual practices, it can feel really convenient to reach for histories that aren't our own. And while I think it's great to learn from those, I would say, yes, please follow tons of Indigenous creators who will teach you so much about this, right? Follow tons of people of color, follow tons of Africans who have these spiritual practices that are really different from ours. But be very, very mindful of appropriation. Just because we lack a strong history on how to connect with our ancestors in colonial white culture doesn't mean it's okay to be pulling from others. What it does mean is that it's time to trust yourself and make up your own rituals. It might feel silly. It might feel like play. And that is one way you can bring your littles in from internal family systems. It might feel kind of ridiculous, but rituals, they're more about the meaning you give to them, the meaning you subscribe to them. And that is allowed. I just want to give people permission. Make your own rituals. If you're not finding one from your history, if you don't know where to start with whatever feels right inside yourself. Check in and do it. And it might feel dumb, but eventually you're going to hit on some things that really feel powerful for you. And, that's where the good stuff is.
I love that so much. I want to do that more too, of just anchoring myself in presentness too, of actually doing a ritual, allowing my brain to actually shift gears from one thing to another. I think we're encouraged to do so much multitasking these days, and it can all kind of be like a blur. And I really want to actually be here in my life and live it, be present for it. So I think rituals could be a really good way to do that. I love that. Do you have a favorite ritual you want to share with us as an example?
Oh, such a great question. There's so many. I recently started making incense. So this is a way that we can pull in like witchcraft, occult, which, not everybody will be comfortable with, but I think that those are really great things to look into. A lot of those are based in like Irish background, Scottish, British, and so it might feel less problematic for white people to engage in, though it is really important to recognize that there is still strong racist histories in those traditions. So please go looking for the good stuff. But yeah, I make incense, and there are a lot of biological properties that different scents, different plants can add to an incense that literally calm our bodies. So I like to kind of do witchcraft around mixing that, as well as looking at how these like witchcraft sort of books ascribe meaning to the herbs, and then also sometimes just ascribing my own meaning of like, oh, I feel really connected to vetiver, like this is what I'm going to use for my base because I think it connects me to my ancestors, right? So that's kind of where that play comes in, of you can combine these elements. So I love to make incense. I really like to do it at the solstices, and anytime that I feel like I need some cleansing and clearing. Another ritual that I absolutely love that I would love to share with your listeners is, I think this is particularly good for people who are highly sensitive or maybe empaths. So anytime I'm in a conversation, because I tend to be somebody who does a lot of support for other people, I work with adults with disabilities, I run support groups. It's kind of like, a role I often take on as a like community healer. So I always picture like a bowl of some type, and it's super dependent on the person or group that I'm with. Sometimes it's like an orange peel, sometimes it's a vase, sometimes it's a whole pool. And as people are telling me things, we're putting it in the bowl together and we're sort of looking at it together. That way I'm not taking it on. It's staying between us, but not coming into my body. And sometimes I'll sort of like also imagine doing some witchcraft around that, like, throw lavender in if I think it, or like, sometimes it's St. John's wort, whatever it is that is coming to my mind that I think that person really needs. Sometimes it's like doing some smoke work over the bowl. And I'm just picturing that while they're talking. And that is one thing that I really like to do that feels like an act of community care. It enables me to have more spoons and presence with people. And also it really helps me as far as not carrying that kind of stuff with me as I move through my day, as somebody who is really prone to do that.
Oh, I really like that. That's really helpful. And yeah, just I love that example of rituals too. I've listened to a couple of books. I got to go back and finish them now, but about just like day-to-day witchcraft kind of a thing. And I know I went to a store and they set me up for something I was really focused on, and they set me up with a candle and things to all the materials, and they were like, and after this amount of time you smash the candle. Yes. And I really felt like lighter after I'd done that exercise and I'd set my intention, so there's so much of that mental connection to it, but mental with a ritual. It was really great. So now I want to go back and get another candle for the next thing. But
do it.
It's just, I'm just kind of laughing, thinking about like, Christians can make a satanic panic out of anything, but the idea of like, oh my gosh, talking about witchcraft on the podcast. But we're here to ruffle a few feathers. Speaking of, love your shirt. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm wearing
this one you wear to church too.
This is absolutely one that I wear to church over my tits that I love as a trans mass person. Tell me about it, y'all. Literally, we need more trans mass or trans neutral people who love their tits. Okay. But my shirt, it says trans fag on it. I am somebody who really loves to reclaim the word tranny, and by extension also fag. And I know that that's very controversial, but I think reclamation can be really, really powerful. And so I am all about the slurs as reclamation. I think it's really important for us to be doing that work. And I'm a trans fag.
Yeah, there you go. I think that's great, because I wonder about that for myself too, as someone who identifies as male and is also attracted to men. It seems like one I could grab onto, but I also worry a lot about the fact that I lived so much of my life with the privilege of being cis passing and straight passing. So, I was internally miserable, but I never had to hear that word thrown at me at any time in my life, in terms of it being a slur. So yeah, it's good to kind of, like with everything we've been saying, consider your place in these things and keep learning and all that good stuff. But
yeah, I think I really struggled with that too until I started experiencing like all forms of hate crimes and slurs being thrown at me. Yeah. Honestly, one of the most gender affirming things that's ever happened to me. I was walking at night and this man called me a slut and a fag in the same sentence. And I was like, nailed it. You're getting that I'm not binary. I've won. And then after that, I stopped caring about worrying about reclaiming controversial terms.
Sure. Oh, that's great. Yeah, no two experiences are going to be the same, and it's another thing that could cause us to be immobile, right? And we talk about being so afraid to make a mistake with something and be like, well, do I have enough trauma and the right kind of trauma to be considered gay or whatever it is, or queer? Right. I have been hate crime, but I also don't have a family, like, because they don't accept me. Like, does that make me count? Whatever. It's just not a helpful exercise. So I love a good empowering t-shirt. I remember being very excited when I first felt confident to go out in my gay and tired shirt. That's
yes.
Really, It's a classic. Now my fiance will sometimes wear it now too. Even though she's basically like, "Is it okay? I still identify as straight." Like, I don't, it's like,
That's
fine. Ugh, straight people, but I love her. So what can you do? Anyways, Ace, you want to jump in here with anything? We've covered so many amazing topics.
Yeah, Ace, what is your favorite t-shirt?
I don't know about favorite t-shirt, but definitely I vibe with reclaiming of slut. I did an entire teaching on that actually within the Erotic Blueprints, where we talked for like an hour of what does it look like to be curious with your desires and just following your pleasure and doing whatever feels right for you and like indulging in that. And that's so fun. So you're speaking my language for sure.
Yeah. So Marcus, you talk so much about control of women's bodies. And I think that one thing that's really important to shout out is the way that the society and laws control women's bodies is so closely connected to the control of trans bodies, and how those issues are really the same issues. Absolutely. Right? And TERFs are really getting that wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And
even just homophobia tying back to misogyny as well, the hating of the feminine in a man because of the idea of the patriarchy, and that, it's all tied together.
It all tied together. Yeah. I was going to tie it back. Ace, this might be something you might want to jump into. So talking about hate crimes and control of people's bodies. One thing that I think might be really interesting to talk about is the way that and suppression of sexuality, the way that sexuality sort of changes and can respond to these traumatic experiences, and how sexuality can often become part of the trauma. And I'm curious if, and maybe I can even talk about the hate crime I recently experienced. I suddenly had all of these fantasies that were not, that did not feel super inherent to me, or hadn't been true for me in the past, where I just wanted to fuck a cis man and have him call me bad words and spit in my mouth, call me slurs, and snack me and stuff. And it was definitely a trauma response. And I think it's really interesting how shame and purity culture and trauma and all of these lines get really crossed over. And for me, being on testosterone. So yeah, I'm curious, Ace, kind of what you might have to add to the conversation with that.
Yeah. So, I feel like this is a much longer conversation than probably what we have time for today. But what I will say is, when we're able to be with what's arising within us, and we're in a braver, safer space with someone that we can trust, or we've set up a container with someone that has really clear boundaries and consent, it can be an incredibly therapeutic space. I had an experience with someone that I didn't know, but I have a trauma previous in my life that I was like, hey, if I could play out this scene with you, I might be able to work out some of the things that have happened. Because I think what happens a lot of times is something traumatic happens to us, and we don't have voice or choice or consent over the situation. And so we continue to live that out in a pattern in our life, and things continue to happen to us. And it's like, we always say, why does this keep happening to me? Why do I keep having these experiences? And what I've realized is, if we can actually take control of those situations and recognize what did happen to us in that space and how our body felt and the sensations that were arising, but then also recognize what the ideal situation is, and how we wish we would have been able to stand up for ourselves, how we wish we would have been able to say no, how we wish we could have changed the end of the story. That's when we can start to rewire our nervous system and actually the neurons that are going on, our neural pathways. And there can be a reclamation of that, where you actually are centered and you're able to have voice and choice, and you're able to experience it from another way. And so I had an experience with someone where I literally told him, this is exactly what I want you to do. And from the outside looking in, people would have been like, wait, what? Why would you want somebody to do that to you? But for me in the moment, I needed to have voice and choice and control over how this was going to play out, so that I could feel in my body what it would have felt like for me to say no and to, be able to stand in my power and my agency and all of that. And so clearly I don't recommend people diving into this and doing it on their own and like trying to figure it out. I clearly I want to preface this by saying some of this work is really incredibly deep, and it's really important to make sure that you have therapists that are there to help you walk through how to set this up. Maybe a sex coach who's there who can help you create your boundaries and consent and do it in a safe and empowered way. But I've had personal experience with this, and what your story was as well is these can be deeply therapeutic and healing spaces where we can come from a place of agency and choice and reclamation of the situation.
Absolutely. And what I love about that response, and kind of how I wanted to tie this back into the conversation we've been having, is how sexuality has sort of been demonized, right, by colonial culture, and has been made a scapegoat for a lot of different things. And how when we're talking about ancestry, when we're talking about doing the work through therapy or, with a sex coach, whatever it is, how sexuality is a really important component to that. And how, as trans people, sexuality can be a really fertile area to do our work and our healing, not only for ourselves, but for our generational trauma, for our ancestral lines, and for our communities. And I think your answer just really highlights that.
Yeah. And if I'm most honest, I wish that more people were doing this type of work, because I think what happens is we have a lot of, sexual abuse and situations where people are abusing power simply because they haven't done the work and they haven't been willing to go there on their own. Right. And so they're seeking out these sexual desires and a perversion, and it's going sideways. And we all have this drive within us as sexual human beings, right? And if you're not actually attuned to what's arising and the reason in which you're doing so, you might be hurting other people. And I think a lot of people are just blind to that. They haven't actually done the work to realize, wow, the choices that I'm making right now have a direct implication or effect or, a negative consequence for someone else. And so I think there's a lot of work there to be done in our society of understanding a lot of the situations where people are getting hurt, it's simply because we're allowing things to go sideways instead of taking ownership of our own journey and trying to bring about healing.
So well said. So well said. It's so important, that self-ownership, and that can come in the form of self-love in so many different ways, but also so that we're not kind of paying that forward. I know this is just scratching the surface of all of your expertise, Ayce. So thank you so much for sharing such a great summary in a short amount of time here as we wrap up. And thank you for sharing your own story. Thank you, RJ, so much for sharing yours as well. I'm honestly just so happy that this has been a safe enough space for you to do that, because I know it can only just benefit our listeners, but I too can relate to everything you've been talking about here. So we could probably dive into a whole episode on it, Ayce. So we'll definitely keep that on the books. But thank you so much for being here today with us, RJ. I know we've got a million resources we'll link down to our guests, so thank you, because the benefit of that is going to be tenfold, I know. But really appreciate you being here on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
And we will link everyone to your podcast as well. So much more to learn and to keep hearing from you. So thank you, Ayce, also for being here. We'll catch up with everyone on the next episode of Wholly Unapologetic.